Good morning. I'll call to order the regular meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee. Today is November 20th, 2014. I'm Lisa Bender. I chair the committee. I'm joined by committee members, Councilmember Wright, Goodman, Johnson, and Council President Johnson. We have just one item on our agenda today regarding text amendments to allow for accessory dwelling units in the city of Minneapolis. And we'll start with a staff presentation on this item.
Good morning, Chair Bender and council members. Accessory dwelling unit zoning code text amendment was introduced by Councilmember Bender in June of this year to allow ADUs citywide. And the Planning Commission at their November 10th meeting unanimously voted to recommend to the City Council approval of the text amendment. So just briefly and basically, what is an accessory dwelling unit? Often referred to as a garage apartment or a granny flat, boiled down to a dwelling unit located on the same lot as a principal residential structure, smaller in area than the main unit, with its own kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping area. Three types: internal, such as an attic or basement apartment, attached or detached. Currently in Minneapolis, ADUs are only allowed in a small portion of the Phillips community through an overlay district. With the approval of this text amendment, it would remove that overlay district and allow ADUs to be built citywide. Why should we allow ADUs in Minneapolis at this time? We feel that it provides an additional housing type we currently don't have throughout the city that hundreds of cities have embraced in order to help accommodate multi-generational living, provide a means for residents to remain in their homes and neighborhoods when housing needs have changed, respond to the increase in number of 1 and 2 person households that want a smaller living space, and to accommodate population growth with minimal impacts to neighborhood character. All right, just briefly going through the proposed regulations. Those regulations that will be applicable to all ADUs. They'll be allowed to be built where single and 2 family homes are permitted. Either the ADU or the main unit must be owner occupied, not more than 1 ADU per lot, and a minimum of 1 off-street parking space per each dwelling unit, but not required to provide an additional parking space for that ADU. Regulations for attached and internal: maximum floor area, 800 square feet, with some exceptions for existing larger structures. Exterior materials must match the principal structure, and we're prohibiting exterior stairways leading to an upper story. For detached, a few more regulations than for the attached and internal. Exterior materials must be durable, brick, stone, wood, for example, looking to prohibit the roof decks, as well as balconies that would face a side lot line. And we want to see a minimum 10% windows on the elevations that face an alley or a public street. Maximum footprint, 676 square feet or 10% of the lot, whichever is greater. That's keeping consistent with accessory structure regulation that we have in place now. Must be 20 feet away from the main house, allowed within 3 feet of the side and rear property lines. Okay, for height and area, proposing that the ADU not be able to exceed the height and area of the principal structure. See that the amendments, maximum area, proposing 1,000 square feet. That is a change from the version that went to the Planning Commission, which we had 800 square feet. The Planning Commission voted to recommend this change to increase it a little bit for a couple reasons. Felt that will simplify a regulation that I can explain in a minute, and then allow for opportunities to have a 2-car garage with a quality living space above. The version that went to the Planning Commission, 800 square feet, there's 2 possibilities, that and a second option. It was a complex second option that would not include the floor area on the upper story if it met a few requirements. We felt, and so did the Planning Commission, that with this regulation, it's counting the entire floor area that has a ceiling height of 5 feet or greater. That will be easier to regulate, administer, and easier for the public to understand and to help control bulk.
Councilmember Goodman has a question.
What happens if the house is a ranch and the backyard has a regular garage, and then they want to put a second level on the garage? They can't do that because the house is a ranch?
Correct, with what we have proposed today, yes. And important to note that with the 1,000 square feet regulation, that we are including the parking area within that. Maximum height, 20 feet. And the diagram below shows how we regulate height, measuring from natural grade for the flat and shed and mansard roofs to the top point of that roof. For gable, hip, and gambrel roofs, it's that midpoint between the ridge, the highest point of the roof, and the bottom of the eaves. The version that went to the Planning Commission was 18 feet, and the Planning Commission felt that a slight increase was important to create more livable space on that upper level and provide more design opportunities. CPED is supportive of both the proposed increase in height and square footage or the floor area.
Aaron, I just want to clarify, since I was part of the Planning Commission discussion, that the maximum area that was allowed under the previous proposed ordinance was 1,200 square feet, because it did not count
Thank you.
a significant portion of the square footage if the structure was shorter. And so this actually limited the total square footage to 1,000 square feet, which is smaller than what was previously allowed. Councilmember Goodman has a question.
I just want to make sure I completely understand this without having to look up the regulations when people call me about it. The 1,000 square feet also includes the area where the garage is?
Yes.
So if it was only 800 square feet and the garage was 600 and something square feet, they'd have 200 square feet to live in?
Correct.
Okay, that would be unrealistic, I would say. So that's important to note, because I think the people out there think it's 1,000 square feet plus the garage, like 1,000 square feet on top of the garage. And that potentially has been a misunderstanding about how much living space there is.
Right.
Really, here you almost can have 400 square feet, about,
If you have a two-car garage
which most people do.
and would like to have, right? Yeah.
The other thing this did was in practice, so because you have only 1,000 square feet, because you have 1,000 square feet total, even though you can make the footprint be 676 square feet, in practice, if you want to have two levels, the maximum you can go on the first floor is 500 square feet, because then you'd have 500 square feet on each floor. So it really pushes them to have a smaller footprint as well.
And
Council President has a comment or question.
I just have a question, and so if we're still asking questions about this, I want you to go back a couple slides, so I don't mean to interrupt if people have more questions about this particular. No? Okay. Tell me about the side, the distance from the side lot line again?
for the entrance, for a pedestrian entrance, or the setback of the structure?
Setback.
We are proposing that the detached accessory dwelling unit be allowed to be within 3 feet of the side property line or 3 feet of the rear property line. If, in this example, you see a garage door facing which would be the alley to the left of the structure, in that case, the detached ADU would have to be 5 feet to allow for easy maneuvering of the vehicle into the alley. I just want to point out that currently for garages, they're allowed to go to 1 foot of the side and rear property lines. So this was an ability to allow for some windows, but to move the ADU a couple feet back from the lot lines to allow for garbage cans and just a little more separation, but felt it was important to keep it at the rear of the lot and not to waste the additional portion of the rear yard.
But if someone was going to build a accessory dwelling unit that wasn't part of a garage, how close can they be to the lot line?
Could you repeat the question?
If they were building an accessory dwelling unit that isn't a garage, isn't on top of a garage or attached to a garage,
Right.
it's just a separate accessory dwelling unit,
Yes,
how far can they be from the side yard, from the lot line on the side?
3 feet.
Even though we just passed the change on the ordinance for new construction, what's the rule on that?
There's different, it's a scale for setbacks for the principal structure that would, as your lot increases, your setback increases
Yes.
slightly.
Okay.
But those regulations did not regulate accessory structures.
Right. I'm just saying we were sensitive in
Absolutely.
trying to limit people's ability to go so close to their neighbor with a structure, but I'm pointing out the contrast here, that's
Yeah.
all. Thank you. So, thanks.
Our goal is to help protect the backyards.
Yep. Okay.
And by having the separation and these setback requirements, we feel that this will get to that.
Okay, thank you.
Could you also, just since we're talking about the backyard issue, what's the difference between how we're regulating accessory dwelling units and garages in terms of the distance from the main house?
Thank you. Currently, garages are allowed to be within 6 feet of a home. And we feel that since that it's important to encourage that protection of that backyard once again, so we wanted to increase that separation to 20 feet.
How wide is a typical lot in Minneapolis?
For there's a few zoning districts that we anticipate the ADUs to be built. R1A and R1. R1A, the typical width, 40 feet, depth, 125 feet, and R1 being a 50-foot wide, being typical for that, and 125 feet.
And what is the maximum width that an accessory dwelling unit could be if it is the absolute maximum footprint that it could be?
Thank you. 676 square feet, or 10% of the lot, whichever is greater.
So is it possible to build an accessory dwelling unit that comes within 3 feet of both lot lines?
Of the rear and the side lot lines? On a typical lot, it would be unlikely that you would stretch from lot line to lot line.
Thank you. That's helpful. Councilmember Goodman.
A typical garage at 676 square feet is what, 20 by 20 or 25 by 25?
26 by 26?
Okay, so that would give you an idea. I just want to try to
Okay.
compare apples
Thank
to
you.
apples here. So 26 feet, a typical garage is 26 feet wide, and a typical lot is 40 feet or 50 feet wide. So there's just no way it's going to hit 3 feet on
Right.
either side.
Right.
Council President.
My point, though, is that you're going to allow a dwelling to be built 3 feet from your neighbor's lot line, and we just changed the rules about housing because of the challenges we had in South Minneapolis with tear downs and people building right up to their neighbors, looking out their door. So that's all I'm pointing out. Thank you. Sorry.
Councilmember Goodman.
And I was super sensitive to that, and I was the one that asked for greater setbacks, but that's where houses are next to houses. This would be where a accessory dwelling unit likely was next to a garage. Because unless every single person on the block was going to put an accessory dwelling unit next to an accessory dwelling unit, what the primary, at least in my ward, what the primary feature is garages in the back, detached, even in big homes. So an accessory dwelling unit would be next to a garage, so I'm less concerned about an accessory dwelling unit being 3 feet from a garage as I am from a house with windows on either side being next to each other. That's why I can live with it. And I just can't imagine with a lot of these existing garages, people aren't going to tear down their garage to build a new garage and build a new accessory dwelling unit, perhaps except in my ward or in 13. It's just not economically feasible. This is not an affordable housing move, let's be honest about that. I mean, there's just no way that this is going to be providing a lot of affordable housing. So it's going to be expensive to do it. People aren't going to tear down their garages to start over to build a unit unless they have some special situation. So it's not like every block is going to go out and do it now. So that there'll be a whole bunch of accessory dwelling units next to each other on any one given block.
Are there any more questions about these issues, or we can continue with the presentation and then I'm sure there'll be more discussion?
Thank you. I think we covered the height and area proposals. I just want to end by talking about the public participation was an important part of this project and had overwhelming support with over 200 completed surveys, those testifying at the Planning Commission meeting, and emails and letters that we received from individuals. Letters from organizations that you have in your packet include letters of support from the Senior Citizen Advisory Committee, AARP, Transit for Livable Communities, Minnesota Area of Realtors, and the Preservation Alliance of Minnesota. And concludes my presentation. My colleague Mei-Ling Anderson and I are here to answer additional questions you might have.
Great. Are there any additional questions for staff? Councilmember Goodman.
Not as much a question. I'm just wondering if it would be possible at this time next year to report back on how many ADUs were permitted within a 1-year period, just to kind of get a sense of if we're getting 3 or 33 or 303.
That's a great idea.
And
yes.
then I'll save my comments for the council meeting, so just to speak to it generally.
Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And we did have an overlay district that allowed these dwelling units. And so the history of how many were built in that, I think would be helpful also in the time frame.
North Phillips, been in place for 13, 14 years, 1.
One, okay, thanks. That's helped very.
There's been some discussion too about the cost of building a detached accessory dwelling unit. And then could you also talk about, we have a state building code that's a little bit different than some warm weather states, which I think impacts particularly the detached accessory dwelling units and the feasibility of converting an existing garage to an ADU. Could you just talk a bit about that? Because I think it is also important in terms of thinking about how many of these we might see. I think it's actually going to be probably more like 3.
Yeah. For the cost, in talking with our colleagues in plan review, estimating at least $100 a square foot would not be a problem to reach that amount, so it could exceed that. So 1,000 square foot structure, you're looking at least $100,000. And for building code issues, could you, Councilmember Bender, the specifics on your question again?
My understanding was that our state building code requires a foundation for any
Thank you.
livable space. So even a detached accessory dwelling unit, which may be different than some other states that have seen more of these built.
Right.
And I
Thank
think
you.
that makes it more expensive, if I
Correct.
understand.
And yeah, it will be working closely with our colleagues in plan review to allow for a conversion of an existing carriage house. We don't want to see those torn down just to build one of these, so there is the possibility of conversions, but it will be expensive in getting engineering reports and allowing for all the utility lines to come in and to make sure you have a warm foundation if there's going to be living space there. So there will be additional expense with conversions of carriage homes.
Okay, any further questions? I will move the substitute motion, which includes a few changes that staff had recommended after looking through the details to make sure that all of the language in the ordinance was consistent. I can just briefly describe the changes from the last version. The first change is to allow for a variance in the height. And this is to allow for conversion of existing carriage houses, some of which exceed the maximum height here. And so the previous draft of the ordinance did not allow for a variance of height, and this would still require that you apply for a variance, but would allow for that variance application. The second change just directs the height, clarifies where the height maximums are described in the ordinance. The third change emphasizes and clarifies that accessory dwelling units cannot be larger than the principal structure. They must be subordinate in size. And the fourth change clarifies that this question that we were discussing earlier, that everything in a detached accessory dwelling unit is counted in the 1,000 square foot total, including all of the built square footage, including stairways and all of the square footage, the garage space, the livable space and everything. I've moved the substitute motion. Is there any further discussion? Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I was one of the most skeptical people about this around. And we talked about this in 5 neighborhoods in my ward for 3 months. Every single neighborhood meeting we discussed this. I demanded staff do 1, and they did 2 public meetings in my ward. There were people who were skeptical as well, and I think that there's a lot of consensus about this now, at least in my ward, which is a lot, R1. So first of all, I want to thank Doug and Brian and our staff and Councilmember Bender and her staff. I think you did a really good job on the outreach. Our office chimed in on our portion of the outreach, but I do think that you guys did a really good job at drawing an ordinance, putting together an ordinance that people think is positive and they don't think is going to change the essential character of their neighborhood. I want to just tell you a story about a constituent in my ward who will benefit from this, who isn't the most sympathetic constituent, but he lives in a part of my neighborhood actually where he has a house and he has a garage, and for a variety of reasons he lives in his garage, not in his house. It's up on a hill. And he was having to come in and actually figure out how to attach his garage to his house in order to be allowed to stay in the house, in the garage, which is where he lives. And for 5 years, Doug and Steve are laughing because Steve lives in the neighborhood and Doug's been working on it too for years. For years, he's been in violation of the ordinance. We haven't done anything about it. He's been living in his garage. All the neighbors think it's perfectly fine. And now without any action, but this action will make his living situation legal and eliminate all of the drama that's been going on with regard to zoning enforcement. And in addition, allow him to live where he's been living, and potentially even now rent or live in the house he's living in as well, because he couldn't live in 2 structures on 1 lot. So there are a lot of unexpected things that could happen as a result of this, and I feel fairly confident, at least the neighborhoods that I represent are pretty knowledgeable about what's going on and generally pretty supportive. And I know there was a little conversation about this up from 800 to 1,000 square feet, but if you take into consideration that the garage is there too, the ADU can only be like 400 square feet. So as long as we're not spinning this as affordable housing, I'm good with it, because it is not affordable housing. This is going to happen in affluent parts of town where they can command much higher rents, or really beautiful, safe parts of town like where Councilmember Johnson lives, where they can command pretty good rents and they will not be affordable. So let's not fool ourselves that this is some big affordable housing effort, as much as it is a way for people to accommodate changes in family and how we define family. And so again, Councilmember Bender, I think you've done some really good work here, and I think you've worked really well with all these other offices and our staff to get to a point where someone like me would say I'm enthusiastically supportive. So congratulations.
Thank you, Councilmember Goodman. Council President.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'll echo Councilmember Goodman's compliments. And I have a little story to tell too, and this is why I won't be supporting this today. I have almost exclusively R1 in my ward, and I'm reading the Realtor's letter, and it says that they agree that the requirements of the ordinance, such as occupancy requirements, unit size, city oversight of the units, will provide neighborhoods with the assurance that these ADUs will be well maintained and used in the possible manner. And I agree, Councilmember Goodman, probably in your ward, that'll be the case. But my experience has been that we don't have really good tools to go after people who have violated our rules. I have one of these built already, actually, in my ward, and as it was being built, a neighbor was commenting and asking us to please look at the plans that this owner had submitted for what he was building, which was a garage, and then he built the accessory dwelling unit on top of the garage without the plans reflecting that. Somehow, let me tell you again, you folks know how hard we work on trying to prevent this kind of stuff, but we just do not have the tools or the capacity to prevent it. It got built. It was being used for prostitution. The accessory dwelling unit was being used for prostitution. And when we finally had the oomph to go in there and actually find out who all was living there, we had 13 unrelated people, some people living in the house, some people living in the accessory dwelling unit, and no rental license. Just another story about how rules are enforced in the city and the tools that we have to deal with people that ignore those rules. They don't work in some neighborhoods. So my citizens, my neighbors have concerns about this. They're very protective of their single-family neighborhoods, and so I won't be supporting this today, but I'm not thinking anybody's going to build a $100,000 accessory dwelling unit in my ward when we have houses that are selling for $60,000. So I'm not too worried about it being overpopulating my ward, but I certainly want better enforcement when we see someone violating our existing regulations, and we just don't have it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I personally think that we've taken up some issues in this committee, this accessory dwelling unit being one, the second one being Councilmember Palensamo's tear down issue, without banding together as 6 people to provide 2, 3, 4 additional zoning inspectors in this division. So, Councilmember Glidden just sent out this memo about committee work plans and the importance of putting together committee work plans. But I would urge us, and I pledge, Council President Johnson, to work with you, as I'm sure the chair and vice chair of this committee will do, if we pledge in this budget to turn around and fund 3 more people in zoning inspections, and they can dedicate 2 of them to the north side, one to Councilmember Palasamo and her tear down issue. That could be one way that we could address the policy changes that we've been making in this committee, because our committee has been making policy changes that have allowed for additional density and provided for additional work, and we're constantly fighting the situation where the staffing is not secure. So I will work with you personally, and hopefully the chair and vice chair and every other member of this committee will come in and say, given what we've seen in our committee, we want this funded in this budget. We should make this a number one priority, even if it means money coming from another location. Because I do think that it's not fair and right to our staff to continue to make policy changes and then complain about the way that they're enforced if we're not providing the funding to enforce it. So let's band together, make a commitment that we're going to get this done in this budget. We have 2-3 weeks now in order to do it, and that would maybe reinforce to staff all the work that they've been doing has not been in vain, because we'll be able to deal with some of the problems as well.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments from the committee? Seeing none, I will just say, a lot of staff time went into this ordinance change. We had 5 public open houses with, probably 10 staff at them each there to answer questions. I feel really proud of how much we really went into this with an open mind and really truly listened to people's concerns. We've included here an occupancy requirement, which in my ward, only 20% of homes are owner occupied. So it really limits the application in the 10th ward and other places where there's, low home ownership rates. So that's a compromise that I feel comfortable making, given that, it was very important to my colleagues to have that home ownership requirement there. So, I think this discussion has really put us in a good place. I totally recognize the issues that Council President has raised with inspections, although I really think that this is, I think that's really a greater issue. This, I think, will add a very small number of housing units over time in the city, certainly astoundingly less compared to the issues going on in the 13th ward or the huge amount of construction that's happening in the 3rd and 7th wards. 92% of new housing units this year have been in those 2 wards. So, we're seeing a lot of growth across the city, which is demanding more time from our inspectors. The Viking Stadium construction, all of these, the huge cranes downtown are really taking staff time. And I think, I think we've also done some policy changes here with this accessory dwelling unit, which we can forward around, which changed the inspection cycle specifically for homesteaded properties. The things that where we require homesteads, those will be separately inspected on a different schedule than our normal inspections, which will, I think, allow for staff to really focus on this issue, with the time that they have. So I wanted to thank everyone for their great efforts, and the staff especially for gathering all of the comments and finding the sort of great compromises on the size, on the ownership requirement, that this can really work the best that we can across the city. So with that, Clerk, could you please call the roll on this item?
Councilmember Goodman? Andrew Johnson? Barbara Johnson? Reich? Warsame?
Aye.
Chair Bender? That's 5 ayes and 1 nay.
Okay, that passes. And with that, our committee is adjourned.